welcome to the analyst of 22nd of September by Vaji Raman Ravi. In today's discussion, we will be covering total 9 articles, starting up with the very important security dialogue, Quad. As recently, Honorable Prime Minister has participated in the 6th Quadrilateral Leader Summit in USA. In the second one, we will analyze the status of insurance sector and the need to diversify the same as highlighted by the Principal Secretary to Prime Minister. And then we'll simplify some other 7 current affair articles for you featured in the Hindu and Indian Express. To learn good details about the same, stay tuned. So before starting the discussion, here is a gentle reminder for you to kindly check out the handout that we have curated for you so that you can understand all these articles in great details. And also, as we have recently revamped the analyst, so we have got these following simplified articles for you as well. Starting with the first article, it is here in the context that our Honorable Prime Minister has recently went to USA for participating in the 6th Quad Leaders Summit in the Delaware city. Now, this was hosted by USA, and this article as such is very important for us because UPSC has already in the mains PYQ asked a question on Quad. So this makes me ask the first question to you. What exactly do you think of Quad? Is Quad a security alliance? Is it a military organization? Is it a formal association? No, it is none of them. Quad is simply an informal, loosely associated security dialogue. So what is Quad? We have understood. Where all the 4 important democracies of the world, that is the USA, Japan, Australia and India, have come together, especially in the year 2017 when it was finally officialized, and then they have come together to call for a similar agenda, that is to have free, open and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. This was also in the background of the rising assertiveness of China in this Indo-Pacific region, which you must have heard of because of the string of pearls policy, because of the 9-line incursions, etc. So these are the reasons why Quad was established. But the genesis was mooted for the first time by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who in 2007 called for an informal meeting of ASEAN leaders before the summit, and also said that we should establish a kind of alliance where we could not only counter the China's assertiveness, but could also forge a partnership which would be beneficial for each of the countries. Now in 2012, of course, in 2007, it was not materialized. Why? Because Australia could not participate because allegedly it was under the influence of China. Second, 2012, Democratic Security Diamond Alliance was suggested again by Japan. And finally, in 2017, it got established ahead of the ASEAN Summit. So what is the launching year of Quad? It is 2017. Now, in the year 2020, the first ever official military exercise was created in collaboration of these 4 important democracies. Why? Because for the first time in the exercise of Malabar, which was previously conducted between Japan and USA and India, was now also inclusive of Australia. So Australia got inducted for the first time ever. And now, talking about this alliance, as I have told you that it is loosely held alliance which is not having any secretariat base. So therefore, we generally engage in the form of dialogues, summits, meetings and partnerships, not in the form of having a particular formal structure or a secretariat or any legally binding treaties. So this is about Quad. Now, what is the significance of Quad? Something which is very important for you to understand. First and foremost is the very strategic importance of Quad. It is operating in the region, which is a global common, but also now seeing rising importance due to continued economic operations, military operations, which is the Indo-Pacific region. In the Indo-Pacific region, we are seeing the aggressiveness assertion of China, and not only that, it has got so many hidden resources that anybody who controls the Indo-Pacific region would ultimately be able to control a lot part of the economic prosperity of region, of the world. So therefore, controlling, and not just controlling, making vigilance, ensuring that there is a rule-based law and order, international laws are followed in this region. For this purpose, a strategic alliance was created, and therefore Quad is also not just known as a security dialogue, but also a strategic alliance. Next is the economic partnership. So when they come together, these four countries come together, it's not just to mitigate the assertiveness of China, but also to find coherence in multiple spaces. For example, space sector, nuclear energy, emerging technologies, cyber security, some other crimes, for example, mining, etc., smuggling, etc., or maritime security. So all of these come under one umbrella, and therefore they have got multiple objectives to pursue. First of all is infrastructure development. They also saw that the supply chain disruption could also happen, that which happened in COVID-19. So in order to curb that, they also wanted supply chain resilience. They also want certain kind of climate change resilience. So all of these are also a part of Quad objectives only. One of them are infrastructure development. So what is the economic significance? They have already committed about $50 billion worth investment for developing climate resilient infrastructure and supply chain infrastructure in and across these four countries. So that is the economic significance, and there's more to come. The next one is maritime security, which is need of the hour for the Indo-Pacific region, which is already a global hotspot right now. The next need of the hour is regional stability, of course, because in order to ensure that there are proper laws followed, the migration is not hindered, the travel is not hindered in the Indo-Pacific region, so that this global common could be used and could be basically utilized by all the countries alike. So for that, regional stability is there, that can be ensured by this alliance. Next is the post-COVID diplomacy, which called for securing the supply chain. So basically all the industries were located, especially of USA and Australia, were located mostly in China. Most of their imports and exports were actually being dealt with China, and once the COVID happened, the supply chain disrupted. And this imperialistic policy of China also alarmed them. Maybe they need to diversify across the multiple countries of Indo-Pacific region. So to build the supply chain resilience, Quad is again important. Next is the cultural ties, because a lot of migrants, a lot of expatriates, a lot of people who are going to these countries are among each other's nation only. For example, a lot of Indian citizens are going to USA and Japan. So cultural ties are already strong, and it can be forged further by providing humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, emergency reliefs, for example, the COVID reliefs, providing them vaccine, etc. So the cultural exchanges are also important, and then also important for debt management. They have already called for a joint portal in which all the G20, under the G20 common framework, all the countries together can come and can help each other with debt management also, especially that saw a rise during the COVID times. Now this is the significance, but of course, what are the outcomes and what are the limitations of Quad? It has obviously seen a mixed outcome, especially from the rival countries. For example, Russia, which calls it the Asian NATO, or the China, which calls it the Indo-Pacific NATO. But it is actually not a military organization, a military alliance. It is just a security dialogue. So this choice of word would be very instrumental for you to score good marks in mains. Second, not only that, the Western countries are actually very hopeful of Quad and would also like to participate further into it, because they have got also vested interest in Indo-Pacific region. Next is the initiatives. Initiatives are across multiple areas. For example, them providing fellowships in order to boost the cultural ties, people-to-people engagement. They have also seen vaccine partnership. There is a global action plan with regards to dealing with COVID. Then the Quad Cancer Moonshoot is also a very important mission in order to deal with the most prevalent forms of cancer, especially the cervical cancer. Next is the Maitri initiative, or the maritime initiative, for training the Indo-Pacific, so that the processes of creating a safe Indo-Pacific could be realized by training the manpower, by building enough resources and enough technologies for the same, which is under Maitri. Next is for cyber security, they are collaborating. Next is they are collaborating in space sector, they are collaborating in climate resilient infrastructure, they are also collaborating in emerging technologies, for example, data analytics, for example, big data, for example, artificial intelligence, robotics, drones, critical technology like nuclear powers, etc. So a lot of areas are there in which they are collaborating, but there is one limitation. Do you see any concrete measure to be taken to provide stability, security, and counter China assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region? No. And that is the problem. The first problem that arises is its lack of definitive structure. I've already told you that this is just a security dialogue, which means essentially it is not having any secretariat. Without the dialogues are not decisions. So they are not able to take firm and strong decisions with regard to Indo-Pacific security. Second is, they are also facing difficulty in addressing China's concern because ever since its conception, it was thought to be against or anti-China. So they are never able to pull China to the same table and bring negotiation with them. Next is imbalanced cooperation. Not all the countries are having similar kind of capacities in terms of military capacities, economic capacities, strategic capacities. For example, think about the military capacity of USA in one hand and Australia in one hand. So there is a great disparity. So this also brings imbalance in their cooperation and coordination. Next, their limited military capability is also there. So there's this example of USA, Australia that I've already told to you. Next is the domestic politics. Domestic politics of India, let's say, would not render it completely under the decision making of USA. So there might be a lack of cooperation and coordination between these four countries. So what is the way forward in need of that? First of all, we need to strengthen the commitment and engagement. Let's say we are only interacting with the help of meetings and these summits, then at least they should be organized on a regular basis and on a more frequent basis, which was not the case. Second, communicating clear intentions so that the other global leaders or the other countries like China could also come and participate into the Quad so as to make its agenda clear, so as to make its objective of ensuring safe, free and inclusive Indo-Pacific bring into a reality. Next is delivering concrete outcomes. Whatever we have seen so far, the Quad Fellowship, Vaccine Partnership, the MET3, Quad Senior Cyber Group, all of these are there, but they are not the concrete outcomes. They are not some concrete treaties that we would like to see or expect from Quad. So that is missing. Second is building a consultative mechanism is very important. Consultation not just from among the members, but also from members who are not a part of Quad. For example, we can rope in South Korea, we can rope in Iran, we can rope in Russia, we can rope in China, we can rope in other players as well. And strengthening military and strategic cooperation is also important. This can be done with the help of conducting exercises and not creating military alliance. We don't want to be another NATO, but what we definitely want is to bolster our military capabilities together. Next is to create something which is Quad Plus, already suggested in 2021. So Quad Plus is when countries, just in lines of ASEAN Plus, that countries like South Korea, countries like Israel, they can also come together and we can have a more solid Quad collectively, so that we can have a more bold stand on the Indo-Pacific security. Now, this is the PYQ asked in the year 2020. I would really appreciate if you can attempt this question and write it down in the comment box. I will be reviewing the same. The second one is about insurance sector of India. The context is expressing concern over increase in frequency of disasters. The Principal Secretary to Prime Minister has highlighted the need for diversifying insurance in multiple domains of India, which gives us a good opportunity to analyze insurance sector in good detail. When you talk about insurance, generally people are limited with the belief that there is only either health insurance and life insurance, but it's not like that. When I'm talking about and discussing diversification of insurance, we should also know insurance sector is broadly divided into life insurance and non-life insurance. Non-life insurance insures not only the health, but also your credits, but also your deposits. So the non-life insurance has got 58% of the total companies of India registered into it, and life insurance has got 42% into it. Now, talking about the insurance sector, this is not a post-independence phenomena when we started regulating the insurance sector or when we started providing the insurance services. In fact, it was back in 1870 when for the first time we had the insurance company in our country. It was primarily to aid and help the British only. It was not available for Indian citizens. But in 1870, for the first time, we got the Bombay Insurance Company. This was available for the Indians for the first time. And after that, after post-independence, we saw proliferation of a lot of insurance companies because they were also profitable. But because they were scattered too much, so therefore, our government of India called for the 1956 nationalization of the life insurance sector. So I've already told you there are two sectors of insurance. So the first one, life insurance, got nationalized in 1956. Later on, in 1972, you will see the nationalization of the non-life insurance sector or the general life insurance sector. And finally, because there was a proliferation of a lot of private investments coming or private companies coming into insurance after the 1991 LPG reforms. So therefore, in 1999, in order to control and regulate it, we had for the first time an institution, a regulatory institution. What is the name? The Insurance Regulatory Development Authority of India, IRDAI. Okay, so we have talked about when were these two branches nationalized, what is the institutionalization structure, and currently to promote it, what is the privatization limit of insurance sector. So in 2000, for the first time, FDI was allowed only up to 26% in the insurance sector of India. Now it has increased up to 74% through automatic route. Further, it was liberalized up to 100%. Now, the liberalization of 100% was not for the insurance companies, but for the insurance intermediaries. Who are insurance intermediaries? They are not the insurance providers, they are not the insurance buyers, they are somewhere between them, which means they are the insurance brokers. So anybody could come into it. There is a 100% FDI limit into it. So we have talked about liberalization. Next is the potential of India in terms of insurance market. So India, which is the 5th largest economy in the world with a growth rate of averaging 7%, has got 11% growth rate in the insurance sector in the last 1 decade. Think about it, with the growing population, there is also a rising need of the insurance. But the problem is our decreasing or our stagnant insurance penetration and insurance density. But even after that, even after compromised parameters of insurance penetration and density, which I'll be explaining in the next slide, even after that, we are 10th largest in the world in terms of total insurance provider. And if we go on rising with the rate of 11%, the current rate of 11% annually, we will reach up to 6th largest insurance economy of the world. Now, talking about the challenges, the issues faced by the insurance sector. The first issue, in order to understand that, you have to understand two concepts: insurance penetration and density. So let's say I am an insurance buyer. I have purchased some insurance by paying a certain premium. Okay. Now I'm not the only person who's having the insurance. All of you and many brothers and sisters of the country would be having insurance, must be paying some amount of premium. So the total premium that my country is paying for insurance upon the total GDP reflects the insurance penetration of my country, which means out of the total money that my country has, how much of it has been used to insure the people of country. That is insurance penetration. Then what is insurance density? It is the total premium that has been paid in insurance sector upon the population, upon the total population. And India has got both low insurance penetration and low insurance density, which means the number of population, the number of people who are having insurance is less. Why is it happening? First and foremost reason, lack of awareness. A very simple thing that you and me are not even aware of a lot of insurance benefits and the best insurance policies that are available across. That is the first thing. Second, there is a negative perception also that they claim too much premium, but the rejection rate is very high. So in case I would want to go to hospital and my insurance would be rejected, then I will feel dejected as well. So there's a negative perception. The second negative perception is because of the own fraudulent practices by and the mischievous practices by the insurance companies themselves. Because think about it, they might overpromise to you and underdeliver it many times. This will also lead to creation of a negative perception. Next is limited reach in the rural area. Most of the population that is most vulnerable is in dire need of some kind of insurance, be it agriculture insurance or their credit card insurance or their deposit insurance. They are primarily located in the rural areas. And they are the ones who are not just lacking the awareness, but they are also fearful of insurance because they do not have information about the benefits of it. Next is lack of product innovation, because we do not have a lot of private companies participating here. Why? Because there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of poor demand, and because of this, they are not incentivized to enter into Indian markets. Because these are less number of companies, therefore there is low number of competition. Low number of competition leads to stifled innovation. So we do not have enough product innovation as well. Now how can we, with the help of policy interventions, curb or cater to these issues? The first and foremost one is to have a regulatory body, which we already have institutionalized in the name of IRDAI. So that has been done to to invite more competition, to invite more private participation. That has also been done with the help of FDIs, but now is the problem, which is the main problem which needs to be dealt. That is the public awareness and the user friendliness of the insurance products of India. For that, India has got a Bima Trinity. This is under the IRDAI vision of insurance for all by 2047, which means we are expecting insurance density of 100% by 2047. So how can this be realized? Some of the efforts are Bima Trinity. Here, first one is Bima Sugam, which is to have more accessible platform, which is providing me all the insurance products in one place. It is similar to that of a Netflix model or UPI model. So this is Bima Sugam. Second is Bima Vistar, because I also need to have just one policy, which is providing me not just life insurance, but health insurance, agriculture insurance, all in one. So one bundled policy is Bima Vistar. And second is to enhance the outreach of insurance information, especially across the rural areas, and also facilitating women empowerment while doing so. So for this, we have got Bima Vahaks. Bima Vahaks are women-centric workforce responsible for creating outreach and information dissemination about insurance sector among the rural population. Next is, we also have got a very inclusive approach. We've got multiple schemes which are providing insurance not just in one but multiple sectors. For example, we have got Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana for health insurance. We have got Fasal Bima Yojana for agriculture sector. We have got multiple for the senior citizen insurance. We have got Suraksha Bima Yojana and Jeevan Jyoti Yojana. These are for the senior citizens of India. So we have got diversified ones, but at the same time, what is the need of the hour? To revamp the nature of insurance products, to make them more user friendly, to make a comprehensive bundled policy, and more or less to increase and enhance the awareness of users. Here is a question for you, and I would like you to attempt that in the comment section. Now the next topic has been covered in the explained section of Indian Express, and it is talking about the deposit crunch which is being faced by the Indian banks currently and what are their implications. It corresponds with GS3 part of the syllabus because it is related with mobilization of resources, and in this particular page it is given. Now to begin with, this article highlights that India is the fastest growing economy in the world. In fact, it is the fifth largest economy in the terms of GDP and third largest in the terms of purchasing power parity. Now, naturally, if it is performing good in the rank of GDP, then it will be creating a lot of demand and definitely a lot of product also. But in the creation of these products, the GDP stands for gross domestic product. In the creation of this product, this article highlights that it is largely contributed by the government expenditure. But let's say if somebody wants to create a building, it is also a kind of product. It would require not just the government expenditure, but would also require some private investment. It highlights there has been a slur or a fall down in the amount of private investments that have been there. So government expenditure though has seen a rise, but the private expenditure or private investments are slowing down in India. Now, the second point that it highlights is the rising unemployment rate. So who suffers the most here? The youth. Because of the rising demographic dividend, we've got a good number of youth population, but at the same time, the youth unemployment is also rising at a hefty growth rate of 17%. Now, why is this particular thing happening? Because there are not enough number of industries. Why there are not enough number of industries or job avenues in India? Because there is no money that the industrialists are getting from the banks, which basically means banks are not lending to them. Now, why banks are not lending to them? Don't they want to earn the profits? Banks mostly earn their profits from the loans only, right? But they are not able to do so because of the poor CASA accounts, current account and saving account that are maintained by the bank, and also because of the poor long-term deposits by the bank, which means there is a shifting deposition pattern that has been observed among Indian population. So if we get surplus money, we are not resorting for banks, rather we are resorting to the financial markets, we are resorting to mutual funds, security market, etc. Now, while this is also kind of saving only, but this is not a long-term saving. So it also highlights that households are shifting their saving from bank deposit to capital markets, and as a result of this, the current and saving account of the banks have declined from 43% to 41% in the last quarter. Now, it also highlights that because of this, because banks have been giving the credits at the rate of, let's say, 16.8%, the rate of depositing growth has been quite low. In fact, this gap is only rising. The deposit growth is at 11%, and when the bank is lending to you, it is lending at a rate of 16%. So a 6% gap is there. So who will fulfill this gap? The bank themselves. And this will also put our banks into risk. And therefore, they have also stopped lending or slowed down their lending rates. It has also reduced the risk appetite by the banks for lending to the private sector, which is a significant job creator. So if we continue on going with this pace, then definitely the unemployment statistics would become even worse. So then what can we do? First of all, we need to save the banks as well. To save the bank, we need to fix a very stricter liquidity coverage ratio as to how much amount of liquid money one bank has to maintain as against its total lended assets. So that has to be more stricter so that banks do not informally and do not exacerbantly spends a lot of money. Now, second, in order to boost the private participation, the government has already called for corporate tax rate cuts in 2019, and PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme, is also there to incentivize the additional production. So these schemes are also there. Some crowding in has also been affected in industries like steel and cement industries. Crowding in means that government puts 5 rupees of money, and because government is hand holding these sectors, it starts attracting a lot of private investment. So crowding in is also seen, but also only in the limited sectors. So the need of the hour, first of all, is to diversify the PLI, diversify and look into the corporate tax rate again, and also to have a stricter liquidity coverage ratio so as to boost the private investment. Also, private investment won't happen if unemployment goes up. So it's going to be a very vicious circle in Indian economy for the time to come. So this is something we needed to learn from here. Now, the next topic is about the export potential of India's plantation sector. What is a plantation sector? It is in which commercial crops are grown in land intensive and employment intensive, labor intensive, management intensive areas, which means that this plantation is mostly for commercial purposes, mostly grown for the export purposes and not exactly to fulfill the food security. So these plantation crops include the tea estates, because they are very land intensive, would require hundreds and thousands of hectares of land. So there's tea, there's coffee plantation, there is sugarcane plantation, there is your rubber plantation. So these are all they all come under the plantation crops. Now they have got excellent export potential, as we can already see in the case of tea and the coffee that we produce, right? So talking about the plantation crops that we have and the geographical distribution, first of all is the tea. So tea, which state is the largest producer of tea? Naturally Assam, and then there is West Bengal, then there is Tamil Nadu, then there is Karnataka. Okay, so this was about tea. Then we have got sugarcane in this expanse. There is a North Indian kind of sugarcane and a South Indian kind of sugarcane, two different varieties. Then there is cotton, which is also a plantation crop in this area where Deccan black soil is there. Then we have got jute. And this area got limited and restricted after a partition from the Bangladesh that you all know already. Then we've got coffee plantations here. These are the major plantation crops of India. Now coming to the article, this news suggests that the export potential of plantation sector has seen a growth, because tea export from the last fiscal were 260 million kgs and coffee exports were of a whooping $1.26 billion. Okay, and the growth rate is also very impressive, 8.9%, which is better than the agriculture sector, which is rising at 4 to 5% annually. Talking about the spices, while almost 50% of the spices exported were value added, 38% of the coffee export were value added. But our tea is not that much value added. So there is a requirement of food processing industries in the tea segment also, just like we have in coffee and we have in spices, so that we can further boost the export. Now, in order to boost the export of these plantation crops, there needs to be regulatory body. They were already set up. These are, for the tea, we have Tea Board of India. For coffee, we have Coffee Board of India. So Coffee Board of India was established in 1942, that is before independence. Tea Board was established in 1953 and Spices Board was established in 1986. To remember it, it was 10 years, it was within the 10 years gap when the Tea Board and the Coffee Board were established, and of course the first one to be constituted was the Coffee Board of India. Where are they located? Where are the headquarters? So coffee is primarily produced in Karnataka, so therefore the headquarter is in Bangalore. For tea, it is in Kolkata. This question was asked in UPSC prelims exam, so I am highlighting it, and the Spices Board was in Kochi, Kerala. All of them are statutory bodies, and some of the important schemes that they have been using, for example, Coffee Development Project, Tea Development Project, Export Development and Integrated Promotion of Spices Board of India, etc. So these are some of the key schemes focusing on these key focus areas and these key geographical regions, which will help us to further grow and boost the potential of our plantation crops. Now, our next news article is about NIA, who's set to create a comprehensive database for the gangsters and prison networks and associate, basically people who are working under organized crime. To make things clearer, what is an organized crime and is it defined somewhere officially? No. Just like terrorism, it cannot have a one solid definition because of its changing nature. The definition existing one would soon become outdated. So there is no such definition. In fact, the United Nations Convention for Transnational Organized Crime, they have also not defined the organized crime but the organized criminal groups. These are the people who are with the intention of gaining certain material or economical or financial gain. They practice serious crimes. What are serious crimes or what are organized crimes? Anything which is punishable for not less than 4 years, and in the case of India, for 5 years or more. These are considered as serious crimes. Also comes under the ambit of organized crimes. Now, organized crimes doesn't necessarily mean that they are the terrorist activities, while they do have some correlation with it. Let's have a look. First of all, what is the objective of organized crime? To seek financial or material benefit. In the case of terrorism, it is to intimidate, to use the weapon of fear in order to have political, social and economic gains. What are the nature of activities in the organized crime? It is very, very diverse. In the case of terrorism, it involves everything which could instill threat, for example, bombing, purging, violence, etc. That may not be the case of organized crime. Now, whether it is committed by individual or not, in the organized crime, it cannot be done by one individual. It requires a network of people, and therefore it also becomes very hard to trace. And therefore, we require a comprehensive solution like this database. Okay, so obviously, this is not the case of organized crime, but terrorism can be done individually as well. Then alliance and relationships are very important in organized crime. It is also important for terrorism. And there are overlap or intersection or not? Yes, because many a times the organized crimes also feed the terrorist activities, and many a times the terrorism, they also create organized groups in order to commit some other crimes, for example, laundering. Now, talking about the different type of organized crimes, why are we discussing them briefly? Because it has been asked in UPSC mains. So first and foremost is the drug abuse and drug trafficking. This is the illegal and unrecorded trade of the drugs, and this is generally done across the areas where illegal opium production is there. For example, the Golden Crescent, Golden Triangle, India sandwiched between both of them. So it is one of the main threats of organized crime in India. Second is smuggling. Again, unreported trading of any product, that is smuggling. Counterfeiting currency. This is prominently seen in the neighboring countries, for example, Myanmar, Bangladesh, where they create a counterfeit or they replicate the features and the security features, the pictorial features of Indian currency, and they used to trade. So counterfeiting currency is there. Next is money laundering, which is basically to make some illegal gain seem as if it has been acquired legally. So money laundering is there. Hawala is also part of it. Next is the armed proliferation and trafficking. So just as we can do the drug trafficking, we can do the arms trafficking also and human trafficking also. All of them come under the ambit of organized crime only, because the penalization is for more than 10 years. Next is contract killings and kidnappings. This is also a part of organized crime. So you can see that terrorism is not a part of, it is not a type of organized crime, but it can be associated and interlinked with organized crimes. Now, talking about NIA from the prelims point of view. National Investigation Agency, which was constituted in 2009 under the Act of 2008. Why? Because of the Mumbai terror attack. It is a central counter-terrorism law enforcement agency, which was formulated after the very infamous 26/11 incident of Mumbai terror attack. It has got multiple branch offices, but the headquarters is located in New Delhi. For other details, for example, the jurisdiction, the function and reasons for creating NIA, you can refer to the handout. Now is the PYQ time. So discuss the types of organized crime, describe the linkage between terrorist and organized crime that exist at the national and transnational level, and I hope this discussion would be helpful in creating an answer for it. The next topic is NGT, National Green Tribunal, recently ordered classification of Nainital town into prohibited, regulated and developmental zones. This corresponds with the GS3 part of the syllabus where you have to read about environment conservation, a very important topic. So what is it telling is, because keeping in mind the environmental sensitivity, you have to do the zonation just like we do in Western Ghats, we do in Himalayan landscape. So similarly, as while taking up the local area approach, we also should be categorizing the Nainital region. Why? Because of multiple threats have been seen. For example, degrading quality of the Naini Lake, which was a hot tourist hotspot. Also, the declining water level of many reservoirs, including the Nainital or the Naini Lake. So these have sparked the concern about the environmental abuse that is going on in this region, which could also compromise with the economy, because ultimately the tourism would be compromised. So to take care of it, NGT has called that in order to ensure that the carrying capacity of this area is respected, for that there should be zonation of prohibited zone, regulated zones and development zones. In the development zones, you can set up the industries, residential places, etc. In the regulated one, you need to have permission, and the prohibited one you cannot do, especially near and around the Naini Lake. Okay, this is also something, this decision has also been guided by the amicus curiae. Who is the amicus curiae? Amicus curiae is a friend of the court. It could be a person or an organization appointed by the court to help them with their information, advices or their expertise. They are not either of the legal party, so they give a very impartial information or a very impartial expertise or opinion on the same. This helps the court or the quasi-judicial body like NGT to make the decisions. Talking about this quasi-judicial body NGT, when was it established? In the year 2010. And what is the composition? It is said that the composition should be having one chairperson. Chairperson should be a judge of Supreme Court. Judicial members should be judge of High Court, Chief Justice of High Court, and expert members who must have had minimum 15 years of experience in the environmental and related matters. It is also said that each bench of NGT will comprise of at least one judicial member and one expert member. How many benches are there? First of all, the head office is in New Delhi only, but then we also have it in Bhopal, we have it in Pune, we have it in Kolkata and Chennai. Okay, so these are the other offices. Next, what are the powers? It has got all the civil powers against the civil cases relating to environmental issues of all these statutes. Which statutes are not included in it? Anything related to wildlife and tribes. So, the 2006 Act of Forest Dweller Right Act and the 1972 Act of Wildlife Protection Act is not included under NGT's jurisdiction. This is something which will be helpful for you to eliminate in prelims. Next, it is not bounded by the Code of Civil Procedure. Then what is it bounded by? The IPC, CRPC? No. By the principle of natural justice. This is again a very important fact to be reminded of. In the next one, we will read about the other menaces that are caused by antibiotics abuse or irresponsible use of antibiotic. The one which is highlighted over here is the inflammatory bowel disease or the IFD. Likewise, it also results into a milder form of the similar disease, which is the irritable bowel syndrome. So first of all, decoding the news, it has been found that the antimicrobial abuse or the antibiotic abuse not only causes antimicrobial resistant bacteria, but it also causes microbiome disruption, which leads to dysbiosis, which means the proper functioning of your respiratory system, digestive system, urinary system would be compromised because the adequate amount of microbiome has been affected. Next is, in this particular news, it has been highlighted that the mucus barrier breakdown can also happen as a result of overconsumption of antibiotics. So what happens? Our intestine, it also has a lot of acid, a lot of microbiomes. Naturally, good bacteria, bad bacteria, both are there. But there is something which covers or which saves our epithelial tissue from these microbiomes, or especially the harmful microbiomes, and this is the mucus layer. But what happens if we overdo or underdo the antibiotic prescription? Then in that case, this mucus is also eroded, and as a result, the epithelial tissue starts getting eroded. Why is this happening? Because mucus layer is not there, protective layer is not there, so the harmful bacteria are directly able to slumber over these intestinal layers. This is the third problem highlighted due to abuse of antibiotics, along with creating antimicrobial resistant bacteria in the body, which could be of multiple types: drug resistance, even worse, multi-drug resistance, even worse, extensive drug resistance in body. Next is, which renders you non-curable against some of the life-threatening diseases, for example, pneumonia, for example, tuberculosis, for example, typhoid, etc. And it also causes dysbiosis or microbiome disruption. It also causes mucus barrier breakdown, and this mucus barrier breakdown leads to inflammatory bowel disease. And therefore, antibiotic is a classic example of medicine turning into a poison. So it is a classic example of medicine-poison paradox. Antibiotics were the same things which eradicated smallpox and saved our lives, considered as miracle drugs, are now leading to a lot of diseases and eventually deaths in many cases, because the body is rendering ineffective to antibiotic because of its misuse or improper use. The next one is a breakthrough development made by India in the cancer treatment. So the Indian Cancer Genome Atlas Foundation has launched country's first comprehensive cancer genomics repository. It's not a treatment, it's a database. What is the requirement of a database? To understand that, first of all, what is cancer genomics? Cancer genomics is a study for studying the totality of DNA sequence and gene expression differences between the tumor cells and the normal cells of the body. Why are we doing this? Because cancer itself is a genomic disease. It is because of the changes or the alterations in the DNA patterns or in the genetic patterns that the cells multiply uncontrollably. So because it is happening because of genetic mutations or alterations, we need to study the same thing. So why is the need of studying the cancer genomics? So that we understand what kind of genetic expression could create cancer in body. To study the same, this is not the first of a kind which has been done by India. There was already something in USA going on in the name of Cancer Genome Atlas program. And this particular body, Indian Cancer Genome Atlas, is also subsidiary of the same program. This is pioneered and headed by USA. Okay, so the Atlas program already garnered about 20,000 primary cancer patient database, created a repository of the same, and this began in the year 2006. And we are starting now in the year 2024. But nevertheless, UK also has got a similar program, which is 1 lakh genome project, where it actually analyzed about 13,000 cancer patients and created a repository of the same. So people believe that once we acquire the good amount of information of genomics of cancer, we will be able to have better targeted delivery, better customization of the cancer treatments. Talking about cancer as a disease, it is disease of a genome, as I've already told you. It is caused because of alterations in the genetic material, which could be inherited or which could be acquired. The most prominent forms of cancers are the oral cancers, the breast cancer and the cervical cancer in the world. It is also a major public health concern because every year 20 million patients are affected by cancer. Also, out of these 20 million, 1.4 million are coming from our country only. So the gravity of cancer scenario is even worse in India. And to deal with it, there are certain government initiatives which are there. First of all is to have a national cancer grid, so as to have the database of all the cancer suffering patients in the country and their medical history. And this cancer grid has also created a Quetta Center of Digital Oncology for establishing digital technologies and modern emerging technologies in advanced cancer treatment. Then we have also created tertiary cancer care centers for providing affordable operations for the cancer patient. Then there is higher focus on oncology, especially in the AIIMS colleges and hospitals, and also screening of 3 common cancers, which is the oral cancer, the breast cancer, and the cervical cancer, is also provided at affordable rate on priority via the Ayushman Bharat Health and Wellness Centers. So it is also primary focus of the Ayushman Bharat mission. In the last topic, we will be reading about a very important scheme which is instrumental in creating the trust governance in our country, the Vivad Se Vishwas 2.0 scheme, recently launched in the budget. Now, one major pain point of the government is to effectively collect the taxes because it forms essential pool of the revenue for the government. Another pain point for the citizens, for the earning citizens of the country, is to pay the taxes, to file the taxes, to claim their rightful returns without facing any litigation. In order to ensure that the gap between these two and the challenges faced by both of them are dealt with, government has launched a trust-based governance model which is to expedite the tax-related settlements. So this is the Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. Now here the intent is to create a streamlined appeal process. So anybody who's aggrieved can now have access to a process which has been created by Vivad Se Vishwas, where the Joint Commissioner of Income Tax Department, along with the Appellate Tribunal of Income Tax and the higher courts, all of them will be there in the single platform so that a person can avail for a cost-effective resolution of the litigation. Also, for all the cases, for all the pending cases before 22nd July 2024, if they are resorting to resolve through this particular process, they will attract no interest, no penalty, and no prosecution whatsoever. Is this available for all the cases? No. The cases which are under the prosecution, they cannot be resolved under the Vivad Se Vishwas, but the entire idea is to have a faster settlement and quicker resolution of the disputed tax matters of India. So thank you so much for attending the discussion. If you have any further queries, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much and have a nice day.